Figure 1 shows the rate of deaths per 1,000 prisoners between June 2008 and June 2017. This indicates that unfortunately there was 97 self-inflicted deaths from 2016 to 2017. In Figure 2, we can see that self-harm in prisons appears to be on an increase. There was 40,414 reported incidents between March 2016 and March 2017, 474 per 1,000 prisoners, nearly half. This shows a 17% increase when compared to the year before. Ultimately, these figures are unacceptable and reform needs to occur. No prisoner, no matter how appalling the crime, should feel it necessary to take their own life or hurt themselves in any way whilst behind bars.
There are various factors known to contribute to suicide in prison. These include mental illness, segregation, wrongful conviction, and overcrowding. All of these stated factors could be subject to prison reforms in an attempt to reduce the prevalence of prison suicide. A 1998 survey estimated that 90% of prisoners were experiencing mental health problems. However, a more recent survey in 2017 suggested just 37% of prisoners had reported a mental health issue, and only a mere 10% of the prison population in England were receiving treatment for mental health problems. Clearly, mental health is frequent inside English prisons, but is not being effectively dealt with, which will reduce the risk of suicides. The Howard League for Penal Reform made the following observations around mental health treatment in prisons. Firstly, staff are inexperienced and lack training around mental health. Additionally, mental health services were mainly seen by prisoners as providers of medication. Furthermore, prisoners described a culture where distress was not believed or responded to with compassion. Evidently, the current state of mental health teams in prisons is not adequate. In their understaffed and undertrained condition, they will not be able to help the most vulnerable prisoners in desperate need. There is also the issue of overcrowding. From 1990 to 2012, the prison population in England and Wales increased nearly 400%. This has resulted in vastly higher prisoner-to-prison officer ratios as government funding struggled to keep up with this growth. With this rise, prison officers now struggle to make the personal connections they once did with individual prisoners, meaning warning signs of suicidal tendencies are harder to notice and the inmates often feel they have no one they can reach out to. Further to this, widespread staff shortages may result in more frequent use of solitary confinement, another potential contribution to prison suicides. Solitary confinement is a form of imprisonment defined under international human rights law as the confinement of prisoners for 22 hours or more a day without meaningful human contact.
Despite being contrary to the international human rights standards, many prisons are subject to long periods in solitary confinement, which has detrimental effects. It's submitted that teenagers and young adults' social and emotional development is stunted in the practice of solitary confinement within prison. It's likely to lead to these young criminals feeling alone and out of touch with the world around them. It's logical for these feelings to then manifest in acts of self-harm and increase the risk of suicide from a young age. A statement released by British Medical Association, Royal College of Psychiatrists and the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health reads, "Studies indicate an increased risk of suicide and self-harm amongst those placed in solitary confinement. As children are still in the crucial stages of developing socially, psychologically and neurologically, these are serious risks of solitary confinement causing long-term psychiatric and developmental harm." The Howard League for Penal Reform states England and Wales are out of step with growing international consensus that children should never be placed in solitary confinement. It's time for change. The same ideology stands for inmates in other jurisdictions too. The American Journal of Public Health released a study from the New York City jail system between 2010 and 2013. They found similar results in that acts of self-harm were strongly associated with the assignment of inmates of all ages to solitary confinement. Inmates punished by solitary confinement were approximately 6.9 times as likely to commit acts of self-harm. A quote from K.L. Blackinger reads, "Some people think that solitary confinement is basically spending time alone. It's not. It's like being buried alive." The point of having a prison sentence is set to be punished within that period of time, in the hope to come out reformed and re-enter society as a law-abiding citizen. However, in the current climate, criminals are serving their time but leaving with mental problems which can be life-threatening. This was the case for Khalif Bauda. Browder was arrested under suspicion of stealing a backpack back in 2010. He was just 16 years old. Despite never being charged, he spent 3 years in New York City jail. He spent the best part of 2 years in solitary confinement whilst in jail, and 2 years after he was released, he hung himself outside his mother's home. Like many, Browder was failed by the prison system and was subject to abuse from prison guards. Spending so much time in solitary confinement at such a young age was inevitably going to have incredibly grave consequences.
As the causes amounting to the high rate of suicide in prisons have been established, it is vital that work is now done to reduce the number of suicides within prisons throughout the UK. In line with what Justice Secretary Liz Truss said in 2017, we are in agreement that these are indeed long-standing issues that will not be resolved in weeks. However, action needs to be taken and taken seriously. The Howard League for Penal Reform is an important step in the right direction. A coming together of the Howard League and Centre for Mental Health, it is a joint programme that is aimed at saving lives behind bars. Key points of the report include the detrimental effect that solitary confinement has on prisoners, and that all prisons should have enough staff with the right mix of skills and experience to keep inmates safe from harm. The report also stipulates that in order to reduce the amount of suicides within prisons, prisons themselves need to in turn become safer, healthier places. This would include numerous fundamental changes that would promote the mental and physical well-being of most inmates, as well as mitigate the harmful effects that the concept of imprisonment can have on inmates' well-being, regardless of age or gender. The report concludes many things. Firstly, that the Ministry of Justice must invest in staffing and ensure that the role of a prison officer is a rewarding and fulfilling occupation, a job that people want to do in order to help prisoners turn their lives around. Prisoners should also be healthy work environments for staff, where they are not expected to work in an environment where violence, death and self-harm are everyday affairs. Research conducted by Ludlow et al. In 2015 for the Harris Review found that prisoner-staff relationships were key to managing suicide risk in prison, along with suicide prevention measures such as ACCT. This would go hand in hand with reduction of the population of prisons, as it will take up additional resources. This leads on to the next point. The report submitted to the government in 2015 that the population of prisons should be halved, resulting in a prison system that is smaller and far more efficient in the rehabilitation of criminals. This is because the prison population has almost doubled. It stood at 44,975 in 1990, and in September 2016 there was over 85,000 people in prison across the UK. As Peter Dawson, director of the Prison Reform Trust, said, reducing the jail population is the only realistic way to make our prisons safe in the foreseeable future. With few cost implications, the current incentives and earned privilege scheme, along with the overuse of segregation units, should all be abolished according to the report. It is clear that this would have an immediate and positive impact on the well-being of prisoners nationwide. All prisoners should be treated humanely, yet solitary confinement, which contravenes international human rights standards, is continuously used in prisons throughout the UK, when it has been noted that segregation inherently reduces protective factors against suicide and self-harm. Ultimately, segregation can have a serious adverse psychological effect on prisoners, increasing the risk of suicide massively, even beyond the period of solitary confinement. To conclude, although we sometimes lack the ability to accurately predict if and when an inmate will attempt or commit suicide, with the right reform in terms of prison officials, healthcare, prison population, internal schemes and other factors, change could be enforced and lives could be saved. Ultimately, mental health personnel are in the best position to identify, assess and treat potentially suicidal behaviour. Even though not all inmate suicides are preventable, many are, and a systematic reduction of these deaths can occur if comprehensive suicide prevention programmes are implemented in correctional facilities throughout the UK and the world.